Let's do a little bit. New face. Have you been in my class before? Okay, new face. My name's Michael Clapp. I'm currently serving as your broker for the office, although that's probably just maybe a couple of weeks away, and Veronica will take over as the official broker of the office. However, I'm an investor in the office, so I still have a vested interest in making sure that you do a really great job. My real job, I guess, my job when I'm not here is I'm the team leader at the Keller Williams over in Kingwood. So if you're ever over in that neck of the woods showing clients and are lost or need help, don't hesitate to stop in. We're right there on Westlake Houston Parkway. We'll be happy to give you a conference room and a computer and all your things you need, so help you out. So today we're actually going to cover the lease agreement. These would be the documents that you would use to help a prospective tenant move into a property or find, secure a property that they were looking for on a lease home. I don't necessarily cover the lease listing agreements when we're going through the contract forms, because I really feel that once you kind of feel comfortable with the lease agreement, the lease listing agreement is not hard to complete. Because you're basically just saying, Mr. Landlord, what do you want to do? How would you want a lease to look like? Well, that's basically, feeling really comfortable with the lease agreement. So if you can kind of get to the point where you feel good about the lease agreement, dealing with a lease listing is not hard to do. It's a pretty simple process. I love leases for newly licensed agents. I think it's a great first transaction for a lot of people. It may end up being one of your first deals as a lease agreement because for a couple of reasons. Number one, they pay pretty quickly, which is nice because you feel like all you've been doing is writing checks at this point, so it's kind of nice to maybe start filling that bucket back up a little bit. It doesn't pay a whole lot, but it does start paying you some funds, and that can certainly help get you through a rough spot as you're trying to start build your business. The second thing is that leases are not hard. And I think we're all nervous about dealing with a client, and so it's a little comforting to know that maybe one of our first transactions isn't one of those with the weight of the world on it that can cause a lot of concern and drama and emotions and everything that goes with someone that's thinking about buying a house, right?
Yes.
So they understand that it's a temporary solution. It's not, forever. And although they may not find exactly what they're looking for, they at least know that it's not forever. So they're more accepting to maybe making some concessions. So I think some great kind of ground rules for leases that you can use in your understanding of the lease market. And some of these you would want to share even with the client to kind of help educate them about the lease market, can kind of get you off to a really good start. So let's start with how much do homes normally lease for? In our market, and it can vary a little bit from one particular neighborhood to another, but on average here in Houston, most homes will lease for about 1% of what the house would sell for. So $150,000 house should lease for around $1,500 a month. It's a pretty simple calculation to make. It's not always exactly 1%, but it'll come really close to that when you do the math. So when you end up with a client who's giving you their laundry list of what they want their house to have and where they want their house to be and everything that's the ideal lease property for them, and they end up explaining all the great amenities that house has, and in your mind you're sitting there going, oh wow, that's a $200,000, $300,000 house, this is going to be a nice lease. And then you say, and what can you afford? And they go, we can't go over $1,200 a month. Then there's a big divide that needs to be reconciled. They're either going to have to up their budget or start eliminating from that list so that you can even share with them saying, what you just explained to me, what you just described is a house in this neighborhood that would probably sell for anywhere between $200,000 to $300,000. And that would mean that it would lease for about $2,000 to $3,000 a month. So in order for us to get to your $1,200 a month budget, what is really most important to you? Is it the school district? Is it the number of bedrooms? Those kinds of things. So you kind of have to start helping them kind of zero in it. Because as a new agent, you're probably starting to become a little bit more familiar with the price ranges of other neighborhoods. You're out touring, you're maybe visiting new homes, you're out possibly just prospecting and trying to get familiar with the neighborhoods. So you're starting to see what houses are at least on the market for, but you don't really know what the lease market looks like in that neighborhood. So use that as your barometer there.
And age of the house also, age of the property, age of the property.
Well, that goes into pricing too, right?
Yes.
I mean,
Because
all things being equal, mostly new homes will usually sell for more than the older homes. So yeah, age will play into the price of the home, both in how much it would lease for on a monthly basis versus what it would lease for, and location obviously is I think a big deal. I have two grown sons who are both leasing homes down in the Gardoux area of Houston, which is kind of the Heights wannabe neighborhood, and those houses in the Humble Kingwood area would go for about $1,000 a month, and they're paying close to $2,000 a month because of location. They're close to everything in Houston, so age doesn't always. It's more location, I think, and sometimes you have to just play it all together. All right, the other thing that I think is important for your client to understand, and for you, is that most lease homes are going to want at least a 1-year term. They really don't like doing anything less than a 12-month lease agreement. However, we end up with tenants who need something shorter than a 1-year lease agreement. Maybe they're building a home, or whatever their circumstance is, they really don't want to make a 1-year commitment. They prefer a 6-month lease or a 9-month lease, and they don't want to go to an apartment complex, which would probably be more forgiving in the term scenario, but they want a house. And so when you're getting into the MLS and you're searching for homes that are less than 1 year, or at least they're advertising that they'll take less than 1 year, you may or may not even get a result, because it's going to be a very small population of homes, or landlords, that are looking to take less than 1-year tenants. So how do you find those? Well, you really kind of have to start doing a little bit of CSI in the MLS. You're going to look for homes that have been on the market for a while. So start with homes that are occupied, or at least they say they're occupied, or they may not even be occupied, but they're on the market for at least 1 year. They're asking for a 1-year term, but they've been on the market for 40 days. Well, those are my prime candidates. And then I'm going to look at those and see which of those are potentially vacant. Sometimes in the MLS they'll advertise immediate occupancy or vacancy as of January 15th. And here we are, mid-February, and it's still on the market and vacant. Those are your prime candidates for potential short-term leases. You're going to have to call the listing agent, though, and go, hey, I've noticed you've got this property. It hasn't leased yet. It looks like it's vacant. I've got tenants that need this term. Any chance your landlord would consider taking less than 1 year? Because for most landlords, cash flow is very important to them. If they're holding a home vacant, that's just money out of their pocket week after week after week. They don't like to maintain the house. They don't want to keep the utilities on the house. They want someone in that property. So they might be willing to concede term over cash flow. So just kind of use that criteria as trying to find the properties that are potential short-term leases, and just contact the listing agent and see if there's any chance the landlord would be willing to do something short-term. The third issue.
If there is a lease for 1 year, for instance, and I want to vacate a property, I'm a lessee, I want to vacate a property. What is the position in relation to law about the
Okay, so you're a tenant in a property, you've signed a 1-year lease,
yes,
but you want to vacate prior to that 1-year lease
yes,
coming up. Well, technically, you've signed a contract that says that you're obligated to pay that landlord the full term of the lease, okay? The landlord can certainly come after you for not making those payments. You move out in the middle of the night and you've got 3 months left. He can come after you legally and say, you owe me 3 months worth of income. So he'd have to legally come after you. Hire an attorney, take you to small claims court, whatever the amount is, to try to get that out of you. Some will, some won't. Now, you've obviously lost your deposit. You're not going to get your deposit back because he can offset that against that.
Yes.
The one thing, though, that if he ended up getting in front of a judge is that most judges are going to want to see that the landlord made an attempt to minimize the damage. In other words, he put the house on the market immediately, and he potentially got another tenant in there the next month. So really, he's only out 1 month's rent as opposed to 3 months' rent. So the judges will kind of look at that and say, well, what did you do to minimize your damage? You can't just say I've been damaged and, you know, roll over like a turtle and I can't roll back over. You've got to minimize your damage, and the judge will typically still award that damage to the landlord because the tenant signed an agreement. Now, there are some provisions in the lease agreement, and we'll get to those at the end, concerning military service. There's some outs for, you know, military service. You're in the reserves or whatever. You get called up. There's some things that allow you to get out of a lease for those kinds of things. There's also some for domestic violence. So if you're, you know, in a domestic violence situation and you've got to get out of that property, then there are some provisions for that. Okay?
Now, if this is a contract, if there is a breach by the landlord in providing certain laxity in providing certain facilities, that may not be on the paper, but if the tenant alleges that there is a breach or inadequacy on the part of the landlord,
right,
how would it proceed?
I would hire an attorney. I would hire an attorney, someone like you, right? Well, you were an attorney in Pakistan,
Yes,
right?
I was.
But you would hire an attorney here and start to see if you couldn't cure that default by the other party. Rattle their cage. I mean, sometimes just a letter saying, hey, you haven't done this, this, and this, and if you don't cure these issues by this date, then we're going to seek damages in the court for the fact that you haven't provided this.
No,
I mean,
can it be set as a defense in relation to the landlord's attack that he has vacated the property prior to the expiry of the lease?
possibly. I mean, maybe the reason they moved out was because the landlord hadn't held up his end of the bargain, you know, of the contract. Then that's their defense. Hey, we tried several times to get the landlord to fix this and do this, and he didn't do it. And so, you know, for us, we had to move out of that property. There are some provisions in the lease, you know, for early termination if there's a default on the other party, but you still have to prove your default.
Right.
You can't just say, well, I think you defaulted. You have to be prepared to prove that default.
Writing letters, one or two letters.
Written documentation is always best. So, just saying, I called the landlord or I had a conversation with the landlord, that's always good, but I always follow it back up with written documentation saying, as we discussed today, I am formally requesting that you do blah, blah, blah. So, that way, if he ever had to get in front of a judge, he can say, well, here, Judge, here's what I did.
And recapitulating that in the previous occasion, this was not done, this
Sure.
was not done, this was
Yes.
not
Yeah,
done.
all that goes together. Yeah. All right, let's move along.
Yes.
So, third item, pets. Pets are an important issue to have a conversation with your tenants about because it will definitely have an effect or a choice of which properties will fit their needs. So you want to make sure you bring up the pet conversation with your tenants at first conversation. Because if they have pets and you didn't ask and you spent time looking for properties that fit their price point, and then we out showing houses and they fall in love with something and they go, oh gosh, you know, this will be perfect for our dog, and you go, oh sorry, this one's no pets, they're not going to be happy with you. So you want to make sure that you're having that pet conversation up front. And when we talk pets, and we'll talk about this when we get to that portion of the contract, pets do not just relate to cats and dogs. It's everything non-human living in the house, okay?
People have a date.
Birds, fish, the rodents, the snakes, the ant farm, all that stuff goes into pet category. So you've got to be cautious of just thinking only dogs and cats, which is obviously most common, but it's not the only thing that are covered by the pet portion of the agreement. All right, so we've got kind of our groundwork with the tenant. Now, there are a couple of documents that you will want to present to the tenant up front at the very first portion of your meeting or in your conversation. Maybe I'm on the phone with them today, we're meeting on Saturday. You know, what are some things that I can get in front of them prior to our meeting? What's the first thing we want to make sure that we present to them? IABS, the information about brokerage services. So even though it's not in your package, I don't want you to think, oh, Michael didn't have it with the lease package, it's not important. It is. We want to make sure you do that. What's the second document we want to make sure we present?
Buyer-tenant agreement.
Buyer-tenant representation agreement. So it's always awesome to get those folks signed up under an exclusive agreement with you. And it is a buyer/tenant representation agreement. Sometimes we refer to it as a buyer agreement just because it's easier to say. Okay, and it covers both. It covers both a tenant and a buyer that are acquiring a piece of property. So you can use it for either transaction, which is awesome because sometimes you might have someone who thinks they're a tenant and then they turn into a buyer. That's great. I don't have to redo that document. We use the same document, or vice versa. Sometimes they can't qualify for what they thought they needed to qualify, so they decide to lease for another year and clear up some credit issues or pay down some debt, and same agreement works, okay? Then the third one that you would want to go ahead and put in their hands early on in the conversation is the first one that's there in your package, the actual application for the residential lease. Now this is the TAR application form, which will probably work on a huge majority of the lease properties that you're showing them. There could be a few that might require a different application form. Some of the properties that are managed by certain management companies might have an application that looks different, then you're going to have to deal with their application. But a big portion of the properties that you are going to be showing them, this application form should suffice. But here's the little asterisk that goes with this application form, and it's kind of in the big, letters with an underline there across the top. Each applicant and occupant over the age of 18 years must submit a separate application. So if I'm dealing with a family of 4 that still has maybe an adult child still living at home, a 20-year-old or a 19-year-old that is still at home, then that means I'm probably going to have 3 forms filled out, right? One for the husband and wife and one for the 19 or 20-year-old son. And it's not that we're looking at that child as being an applicant, they're more of an occupant. And the landlord has the right to underwrite everybody over the age of 18, not necessarily from a credit standpoint, but sometimes from a criminal background, okay? They may not want, they may say no sex offenders, no registered sex offenders. Okay, well, that could be a problem. If the 19-year-old, was dating a 14-year-old or whatever, weird stuff comes up. And that, he may just not want to do that to his neighbors. So who knows? So he may just say, it's an investment property, but here are my standards. And he can discriminate based on that issue of criminal background. That's not a protected class like religion and race and age and familial status and all those are, right?
As the tenant rep, can we ask the listing agent if, let's say, our client tells us, hey, by the way, I have this on my credit and usually affects me and other things. Can we ask the listing the other side, the other party?
Mm-hmm. Ask them like what the landlord is this an automatic no? Here's what's supposed to happen, but it rarely does. Landlords are supposed to be prepared to deliver their criteria at request. Okay? So landlords should be able to tell you, when I'm evaluating, here is my minimum standards on certain things. You can ask. You can simply say, I've got an applicant. I need to know what your landlord's underwriting standards are.
Right.
And go
because
through that.
Unless they let us disclose that information, we're not supposed to disclose it if my client doesn't authorize that I disclose it.
Right.
Because I'm working for my client.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, so just don't forget, and don't forget to point out to the applicant or your clients that, you know, everyone over the age of 18 is going to have to fill out a separate one of these forms. It doesn't provide for applicant, co-applicant, kind of like a loan application sometimes does. This one, everyone's got to do their own. Okay, so just make sure you point that out to them and say, when we meet on Saturday morning, please bring those completed, because my goal is to help us find the right property on Saturday, and I don't want us to have to stop and you to go back home or look up any of the information that you need in order to fill out this application. Let's make sure we're ready to go once we find the right property, okay? You might also mention to them that it would probably be a good idea to bring copies of their most recent pay stubs, possibly a bank statement. Those are always good to have. Might not be necessary, but it's probably good to go ahead and track those down. If they're self-employed, maybe they need a tax return. What did you say?
Was it for the last 2 months?
Yeah, last 2 months of pay stubs is good. The most recent bank statements usually suffice, but maybe they're self-employed, so they don't have pay stubs. So what is the landlord going to want to look at then? You typically want to look at tax return information to support, you know, a sufficient level of income to deal with that. So you kind of have to think a little bit like a lender would think in making them a loan, or just kind of put yourself in the landlord's shoes. You know, if I was renting my property, how could if I come back with a great credit score and no issues concerning their criminal background, how can I make sure that these are tenants that are going to perform under the lease? I want to make sure they're making enough money. I want to, you know, maybe do job verification, which will show up on the application form. But you want to kind of make sure they understand that the landlord's going to want to make sure that they have sufficient income to not only service the debt, but obviously live on. Okay? All right, so one thing that I want to point out before we get actually into the form is kind of the way our lease inventory works a little bit here in Houston. When you're working with that tenant and you're looking at properties that are available to them, you're going to find that it will certainly have some variables associated with it. And this bottom one represents time, and this one represents inventory. If I was leasing a home and I was planning to move out at the end of February, because my lease ended on February 28th, my lease probably has language in it that says that I must give notice 30 days prior to the expiration of the lease, in writing, okay? If I was in a lease that expired at the end of March, then I would need to give notice, you know, around March 1st in order to be able to move out at the end of March. So when a tenant gives notice that he's moving out, what's the reaction of the landlord? I mean, obviously the tenant is complying with the terms of the lease. He's saying, my lease ends, I'm giving you notice, I do not plan to renew. So what does the landlord want to do?
Start looking for.
Do what?
Start looking for another tenant.
Yes, he wants to find a replacement tenant as quickly as possible. He's hoping that this guy moves out on the 28th of February, and he's got somewhere ready to move in March 1st, if possible, right? And that's ideal scenario. So he's calling up his agent going, hey, my tenant just gave notice. I need for you to put that listing back in the MLS. We need to find a new tenant. So you're typically going to find around the first of the month, so if we had kind of plotted out our months here, then we kind of see that usually around the first of the month, our inventory is at its highest level. And then during the term of the month, as properties are active and go under contract, the number of active listings decrease. Well, then we come to the beginning of next month and it'll shoot back up. And so we kind of end up with a shark fin type approach to the inventory of homes that are active out there. So the best time to look at a home usually kind of comes, you know, during the first week of the month. It doesn't mean that everything's gone, but it certainly does indicate that at the very first portion of each month is when we've got our best chance of inventory that's available. So here we are on the 13th of February, right? No, the 12th of February. And we've got clients that we're going to be showing this weekend. Maybe okay inventory. We don't find anything. Is there going to be anything more that really pops up between this Saturday and next Saturday? It'll be odd that something does, but there could be. When's the best chance for new inventory to show back up? First of March.
First of March.
So kind of help your tenants understand, especially now, because we're in a seller's market as far as homes for sale, right? Well, the same thing's happening with lease properties. Good lease properties are going quickly. So if they're not finding what they're looking for, tell them not to get too upset about it, especially if they've got a little bit of time that they can work with it, that our best chance for taking a look at new homes would be at the beginning of the next month. So, yes, sir.
So, in conflict to that, looking from the perspective of a listing agent, when would be the best time to list?
Well, obviously, probably
possible, right?
when the inventory is the lowest, right? But we don't have a lot of control over that.
Okay.
I mean, it's really going to be tenant driven because the tenant's in the property right now. He's giving notice to his landlord, and his landlord's calling you up going, hey, I need to get this back on the market as quickly as possible. So if it's a good home and it's priced appropriately, it'll probably go pretty quickly anyway.
Cool.
All right. So kind of give you an idea of kind of how inventory kind of works on these properties during the month. So if you're doing like a hot sheet, if you're looking at the hot sheet report that comes out from the MLS, you can kind of look at daily activity of what went listed, what went pending, what closed. You can kind of get daily hot sheet reports from the MLS. You'll see that usually around the very end, the very beginning of the month, a lot of new active listings come up in the lease category, and this is primarily why. Okay. So now that we've been out looking at properties, we've gotten the forms necessary to be signed with our tenant. We have identified homes that fit their criteria, and we're out looking at the homes. We're at one that really seems to meet their criteria, and they're happy. They're looking, going, hey, this is a good deal. What's the next step? Well, if I can, I really want to get on the phone with that listing agent. And I want to determine right off the bat, is the property still available? Because you'll find that the good ones will go quickly. And in fact, they may go so quickly that the listing agent hasn't even had a chance to go in and change the status on the MLS. You know, I pulled it up Friday evening, it was active. I made my appointments Friday evening. Here we are Saturday at 11, and we're at the house, and they love it. And I'm calling up the listing agent. She goes, oh, honey, I'm so sorry. We signed a lease on that, at 9 o'clock last night. Well, we can't be too mad at her for not changing in the MLS yet, right? I mean, hopefully they'll do it as quickly as possible, but, it sometimes happens that way. So get hold of that listing agent, because you don't want to go through all this paperwork on a house that's got a deal done on it, right? We want to make sure we're only writing offers on properties that still are a possibility. The second thing that I want to ask that listing agent is, if it is still available, is are there any specific criteria or terms that the landlord would prefer to see in the lease agreement? You will find that some landlords are very particular about some certain provisions that are covered in the lease agreement, and the listing agent is happy to share those with you because it just makes everyone's life easier. It doesn't mean that we still can't negotiate it, but wouldn't it kind of be nice to know exactly what the landlord really wants to see in the lease agreement? And they'll tell you what those terms will be. In some instances, the listing agent will not have that information or won't share it with you, and that's okay too. We're going to kind of go through what is commonly accepted, so you should be able to at least go ahead and move forward with a lease, at least get the conversation started. Okay? So after I hang up with that listing agent, if it's still available and they still want to write an offer on it, then my instructions to them are, before we leave the property, to really go back and look at the home. Really look at it this time. And when they first walked in, they kind of looked at room count and layout you know, oh yeah, this will work and perfect and all that kind of stuff, and the bedroom's big enough for our king size bed and all that. Now I want them to look at it more from a condition standpoint. Because when we get to the lease agreement, they're going to be making a statement that they accept the property as is in its current condition. And they should have no preconceived notions about what that condition might be. Their last landlord may have been a saint and had delivered that property to them in crystal, beautiful, clean, you know, home, you know, and that might not be the expectation or the what happens with this landlord. So you need to get clarity with them of what their expectation is from a condition standpoint. If they expect that house to be professionally cleaned and have the carpets professionally cleaned and paint to be touched up and, you know, the shrubs to be trimmed and the gutters to be cleaned and, you know, all those kinds of things, then we need to know, because we will need to make those a condition of the lease agreement. Okay? We had a situation out of Magnolia several years ago in which our brokerage was the listing agent. Actually, the Woodlands office was the listing brokerage. And the tenant and the agent that was showing them properties showed up, and the landlord was at the house. House was vacant. She was there doing some, you know, piddling around the property, and he was there showing it. And so they kind of casually asked her, said, are the carpets going to be cleaned? And she says, yes, I'm going to clean the carpets. So they went, oh, cool, carpets are cleaned. So when they went to write the lease, they put nothing in this paragraph. And so the tenant shows up at the day of possession and walks in, and the carpets look cleaner, but they don't look like they were professionally cleaned. And she's all upset. She's like, this landlord has lied to us. So of course they call our agent, who then calls the landlord, and the landlord goes, well, I have a Bissell and I cleaned the carpets.
Is that safe provision?
So we've got to get clarity with our, number one, you don't take verbal agreements, right? Everything needs to be in writing.
Yes.
And we don't want to make an assumption about what your version of clean carpets is and what my version of clean carpets is, right? So when someone says, I wonder if they're going to have the carpets cleaned, you need to say, you mean professionally cleaned? Right? So get clarity so that we can then put that in our question, and then we can also make it a provision of the agreement. Okay? All right. So after they've looked through the property, they've made notes of what they might want to have accommodated on the condition, then we're ready to make our way back to the office and start writing up our offer. Now, I like the practice of me, the agent representing the tenant, writing the offer. I've heard stories of agents calling the listing agent, and the listing agent goes, oh cool, well I'll send you over a lease agreement, you can have them sign it. And so the listing agent has written up a lease agreement and has sent it, you know, to the tenants. Well, I kind of feel like that's like a listing agent on a house for sale sending the contract to you and your buyer to sign, right?
Are you able to do that?
I don't really like it. I mean, I kind of think it's better that we as tenants and the agent representing the tenant really go through the agreement together and formulate our offer. Because that's what we're doing, making an offer for the lease. So, you know, I think if they want to send me something, okay, I'll take a look at it, but I'm still writing the lease. And I'm going to go through it paragraph by paragraph with my tenants. I'm not just going to stick it in DocuSign or in .loop and say, hey, here's the lease, sign it, and I'll send it back to them. We need to make sure we're really going through that agreement with them, because it's the agreement. It's what they're signing, and they're going to have to pledge to be in compliance with, so we want to make sure they understand all of its provisions. So if you flip a couple pages into your form, you'll find the actual lease, the residential lease agreement.
So the residential lease application, we present that to our clients at the consultation with the IABS and the buyer rep agreement. They can fill it out, have it all ready to go, and then we can proceed on the other ones.
Yeah, because sometimes maybe my initial conversation is really over the phone.
Right.
So I'm gonna say, great, I'm gonna be ready for you guys on Saturday. In the meantime, I'm gonna be sending some documents to you via email or .loop or however you're gonna send it to them. I want you to know where to review those. The application form, I want you to go ahead and start filling that out,
Right.
so that when we meet on Saturday, we're ready to go.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay? All right, so in the lease agreement, we've got to identify our parties. And the first is the landlord of the property, the owner of the property. So how do we find the owner information? Did you find it page 1 of the lease? You've gone too far.
Oh.
It's right behind the application forms.
Steward title or realist?
Oh, okay.
Say it again?
Owner information, steward title or realist? MLS? No, yeah. steward.
Yeah, and that's really going through the appraisal district, okay? So that's a service that's actually plugging into the tax records and pulling that information. It's a great first place to start, to pull that owner information for the landlord. But you've got to be cautious. Hopefully I've warned you guys enough in the classes that you've been in with me that the tax record is not the deed record. There are times where they are incorrect. And so it's a great place to start, but don't be surprised if maybe after we submit it to the listing agent, she goes, oh honey, you got the landlord's name wrong. It's really this.
I look at HCAD and then I look at the steward title.
Okay.
For comparison.
Okay?
And if anything if it doesn't match, then I call the agent and I ask them.
That's perfect.
What he wanted to reflect on documentation.
Yeah. Because what, here's a really common scenario that happens with lease properties is I buy my first house. And then a couple of years later, after I've made more money in my job and moved up and I'm ready to buy another house, I buy another house, but I keep that house and I turn it into a rent property, right? And then about a year or so, my CPA calls me up and says, Michael, we'd really get a better tax situation and maybe some depreciation schedules if we kind of step this in an LLC. So let's flip it into an LLC. So I go down to my attorney, he draws up the documents, I file that, I've got an LLC now, and I might have even changed the deed on the property to move it from my personal name into the LLC's name, but I forget to change the tax record information. So, it can still all be in the family, but it's not technically correct. So we want to reflect here who is the owner of the property. And if you're dealing with a property management firm, they sometimes are acting on behalf of the owner. They've got the authority to sign for the owner, but they are not the owner. So we want not the property management firm to be there in paragraph 1, who truly is the owner of the property, okay? How that property is deeded. And then our parties are the tenant. And what I'm asking for here is, who is financially responsible for the party?
How would we determine who is the owner?
Well, we're going to start with the tax record.
Excellent, and
And then we're going to rely on the listing agent to give us the correct information. So,
from the county code?
well, the listing agent, after meeting with the landlord, should have exactly who the landlord of the property is. You're not going to go down to the tax record or the courthouse. Do not waste your time going to the courthouse to look this up, okay? It's not worth it on lease property. Just rely on that listing agent having done their job. All right, so under tenant, we're looking for who is the most, we're basically disclosing to the landlord, Mr. Landlord, look at these parties to be the financially and legally responsible parties for the lease. So back to my example of the family of 4 with the 19-year-old son still living at home, he's not a tenant, he's an occupant. Even though he filled out an application form, he's not filling out that application form as a tenant to the property, he's filling it out as an occupant to the property. So under tenants, I'm probably listing my husband and wife because they both have jobs and both have credit scores, and I need that in order for that to be qualified and be accepted by the landlord, okay? Later in the lease, we'll identify all the occupants, okay?
Michael, on the owner, would it be the LLC then, or would it be the
If
owner's
it's
name?
truly been transferred into the LLC's name, yes.
It would be the LLC.
Yeah. All right, and then in paragraph 2, property, we're going to describe the property by its physical address, 123 Apple Tree Lane. And then we're going to also describe it by its legal description, which should come directly off the MLS and the tax record. You should easily be able to see what the legal description of the property is based on the tax record and the MLS, okay? The bottom half of paragraph 2 identifies also any other non-real property items that are going with the leasehold. So what's a good definition, excuse me, of a non-real property item?
Swing set.
Hmm?
Swing set.
Swing set?
No,
I always think of swing set.
no.
Non-royalty.
In a lease property.
TV?
TV? Maybe. If there was, maybe on the
Refrigerator.
mounted on the wall.
Refrigerator?
Like refrigerator.
Washer, dryer, refrigerator,
Yeah.
those are most common in lease properties. Lots of landlords have those as going with the property, okay? You'll know it because the MLS will advertise it. The listing agent will make a big deal of it. Washer, dryer, refrigerator included, okay? You, though, need to be cautious of just relying on putting washer, dryer, refrigerator in this line item. Because if I'm showing the property, it's currently occupied. Remember this story, don't you? I'm showing the property, it's currently occupied by the tenants who are moving out at the end of this month. We walk into the kitchen and there's a beautiful stainless steel, what's a good line of refrigerators? GE profile, Dutch door, refrigerator. And we walk into the utility room and there is the gorgeous, enamel red, front loading on pedestals, washer dryer Whirlpool units, right? And our young little tenant goes, wow, did we hit the jackpot on this house? Look at the appliances that go with it. Because we saw washer, dryer, refrigerator included. So in our lease agreement, we put washer, dryer, refrigerator. On occupancy day, our tenants walk in and the house is now vacant. They walk into the kitchen and there is the Harvest Gold refrigerator. Walk into the utility room and there is the avocado green, washer, dryer. Has the landlord done anything wrong?
No.
No. Did we possibly do something? We assumed that what we saw was what we got. So be cautious. Now, if the house was vacant and I walked in and saw those gorgeous appliances, that makes it a little bit more easy to say, well, that must be the appliance package. But if it's occupied, those might be that current tenant's washer dryer. He didn't take advantage of the landlord's offer because he saw what the landlord had to offer and he brought his own, okay? So if you're going to take advantage of those, be a little more descriptive in that line. I don't think you have to get as detailed as model numbers or serial numbers or anything like that. Just be descriptive. Stainless steel, GE refrigerator, front loading, Whirlpool, washer dryer units, whatever makes it really specific. It'd be hard for the landlord to do a switcheroo on you with something that doesn't match that description, okay? All right, now in paragraph 2, paragraph 3, terms. So we've got our commencement date and our ending date. Now commencement date is the same as possession date. So when does our tenant want to take possession of the property? So let's kind of go through and come up with a scenario. So paragraph 3, let's say that we have a tenant that wants to take occupancy on 2/21/15. And we're going to be writing a 1-year lease. Well, I don't write that through 2/20/2016. I want to actually make my lease expire at the end of the month. I don't know if 16 is a leap year or not, so I'm going to assume it's not. So I'm going to actually write my lease through the end of the month in that future year. So it's actually a 1-year and 1-week lease, right? It makes it so much better if your termination or expiration date of your leases is at the end of a month. It makes other provisions in the lease agreement work much neater if you make them expire at the end of a month, okay? Then down in paragraph 4, we've got our provisions concerning the automatic renewal and the notice of non-renewal in paragraph 4A and 4B. So under 4A and 4B, you've got 2 choices, 4A 1 and 2 and 4B 1 and 2. 4A1 and 4B1 are the most common and most likely choices there. If those are not acceptable to either party, then take a look at whether 4A2 or 4B2 would work, but typically 4A1 and 4B1 are the boxes you would check. Then in paragraph 5, we're going to actually make our offer for this property. And let's say that our tenant has a budget of $1,500. So they want to make an offer for $1,500. But this is on the MLS for $1,650. How can we help them determine whether or not an offer of $1,500 versus an advertised price of $1,650 is a good deal or not? Can we give them some data or some information to figure out if it really is worth $1,650 or not?
Yeah, we run a CMA.
A CMA, so I can look at other homes in that neighborhood with a similar size, similar age, similar amenities, and determine what did they lease for most recently, right? How else can I give them some information?
Do you have access to previous rents or to?
How would I
yeah.
get that?
I don't know.
That's a great idea, right?
What was it?
So she said getting access to previous rent history, right?
Yes.
Shouldn't we stay on the MLS?
So,
Wasn't it still on stay on MLS?
yeah, in fact,
Because when I
they
pull
give
it, my
you, they give you a
rental
little
won't show
link.
Yeah.
It's called a PAR. So when you see the PAR field in the MLS, whether you're in Tempo or Fusion, you'll see PAR and you'll see this hyperlinked Y next to it. When you take your cursor and click on the Y, it's going to open up another box of information, another screen of information. And if it has been in the MLS as a lease property before, you can follow its history. Listed in September of 2011 for this price and went under contract for this price. Listed in 2012 for this price and went under contract at this price. So you can follow its history over time. In fact, you can see what it leased for last year. And guess what? Last year it leased for $1,600 a month. And the year before that, at least for $1,550 a month. You know, so you can kind of see, well, the prices have gone up on this. Should they go up?
Yeah.
Have values gone up?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I can sit there and tell my tenant, well, you know what? I've been able to actually pull the information of where this property was listed at and leased at for the last several years. And I have to tell you, in fact, I can show you, here's where you are. They have successfully listed and leased this property pretty quickly after it went on the market. You can see here, average days on market, 5, 6, 10. It goes quickly every time it's on the market. This one went on the market yesterday, asking for $1,650, and you're making an offer of $1,500. Is there any chance you think you can adjust your budget to come up closer to the $1,650? Because it's my job, certainly, to give them the best value. But it's also my job to give them information to help them make the best decision for themselves, because they love this house. It's in the neighborhood they want to be in. There's not another house in this neighborhood that fits them as well as this one does. Are they going to be upset if we're trying to get them $1,500 a month for this house, and we can successfully look and see that, hey, no way the landlord's going to take $1,500 a month? And if I was the landlord, I wouldn't take $1,500 a month, because I know a tenant's going to come along and easily pay $1,650. So you've got to be cautious about always trying to get them the best price. I think it's getting them the right home, right? Okay. So in paragraph 5, I'm going to revise my offer, because they have agreed with me, and we're going in at $1,650 a month. And the first payment is going to be due no later than the first, the occupancy date. So my occupancy date was February 21st, so I'm going to reiterate that there in paragraph 5A. And then I'm going to check the box that the first month's payment will be made by either cashier's check or a money order. That first month's rent needs to be paid in what we call good funds, certified funds. Okay? So check one of those. I would actually check both of those boxes. Then they got a choice. They can either run to the bank and get a cashier's check, or they can run over to Walmart or wherever to buy a money order. Then I'm going to check under paragraph 5A1 that all future payments are going to be made on the first day of the month during the lease. Then in paragraph B, we're going to deal with prorated rent. Well, I've got a tenant here that's got a prorated rent scenario. If they were moving in on March 1st, we wouldn't have a prorated rent scenario, but we do because they're moving in on a day that is different than the first of the month. So how do you calculate prorated rent? Well, here's my calculation. Take the monthly rent times 12 and divide that by 365. That will give me the daily rent. And then I'm going to take the daily rent times the number of days that I need to calculate. So one way to think about prorated rent is that it's really how much they should have paid on the 21st for the rest of the month of February. So I'm going to count these days. 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. 8 days. 8 times my daily rent is my prorated rent that I'm going to stick in 5B. On or before March 1st, which would be the next first month of the schedule, the tenant will pay blank as prorated rent. Now, some people are going to go, well, why don't I just go ahead and pay the prorated rent now, and I'll make a full month's rent next week on March 1st? Which kind of makes sense. You can't blame them for asking that question, right? Well, here's the reason. I think there's two. Number one, landlords like to see that you can make a 1 month rent payment. It'd be pretty easy to come up with probably, I don't know, what do you think it's going to come out to be? About $400 if we did this calculation? $300 for a week? Whereas this tenant needs to come up with $1,650 in order to get the keys to the house, plus the deposit, which we'll talk about in a minute. The second reason is that the landlord usually takes the first month's rent to pay his commission to the listing brokerage. And how much commission does the listing brokerage charge? 1 month's rent usually, which he will split with you. That's typical, 50-50. Okay? All right. So paragraph C is something we're going to need to get from the listing agent. Where does the tenant need to make his payments? His future payments need to be made at this following address. So we need to know where that needs to go. That could be the name of a property management firm. It could be a P.O. box. It could be a bank account at Bank of America. It could be several places. So it's where does the landlord want future payments made? And then in paragraph D, we've got some boxes to check there in number D3, that in future payments, the landlord can make his rent payments by the following formats. Well, in that one, I like checking personal check. You could check them all.
Cashier check or no?
Well, you could check. You could check every single one of them, but typically, what's happened is now the tenant has the right to make his future payments by personal check. That first one has to be made in good funds, either cashier's check or money order. But all future payments can be made by personal check. Okay. Then in the second part of that sentence, it says the landlord may or may not. Usually, you want to check the word may. charge a reasonable fee to process or accept payments by, and then I would check the box for electronic payment.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to go back, but you said for 5A, you said that's normally a money order or cashier's check?
Yes.
Okay. And then from there on.
Good funds is what we call it.
Okay, and then from there on is the
Right.
partial
Yeah,
check.
that's
Okay.
what we're on now. So, usually in the second part of paragraph D3, you're going to check the box that the landlord may charge a reasonable fee to process accept payments by, and then you want to check the box for electronic payment. That's also similar to a wire transfer. Wire transfers are considered electronic payments. So why would we give the landlord the right to do that? Because he will want that right. So we might as well just go ahead and concede it, okay? If I was gonna wire transfer money from my account into your checking account because I owed you money, when I go to the bank, they're probably gonna charge me a wire transfer fee to initiate that wire transfer. When your bank receives that wire transfer deposit into your bank account, they usually charge a handling fee on that end too. So if I owed you $2,000 and they deducted $20 at the other end of the bank, I've shorted you the $20 because your bank collected it, okay? So that's why the landlord could charge a fee to cover that, okay? All right, at the top of the next page in paragraph 6, we've got late charges. Now this could be one of those places where when I ask that listing agent, does the landlord have any specific terms or conditions that the landlord will want to see in the lease agreement? This could certainly be one of those places where then I give you some of those terms and conditions. But when they don't, or even if they do, you can kind of use these terms and conditions as potential measuring sticks. So paragraph 6A, usually the payment has to be made no later than the 5th day of the month. And then in paragraph 6A1, I'm going to check box A, and I'm going to calculate how much 5% of my lease payment would be. Okay? So what would that be? 80,
82, 83.
8250?
Yeah.
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 Damn, you're good.
For some reason, I usually put $1,500 in there, and $75 is easy. So I don't know why I put $1,650. I need to get back to my easy Aggie math. So 8250. So I'm going to check box A, and I'm put 8250 in that box. Because I want my tenant to know exactly what the late charge is going to be. I could easily check box B and put 5%. It's the same math. But I think for a tenant, 8250 sounds a little bit worse than 5%. So I want them to know it's $8250 late charge. And then in paragraph 6A2, there's an opportunity for the daily late charges if they fail to make their payment. And I put these in buckets. So anywhere from 0 to 2,000 is 10. 2001 to 3,000 is 20, and 3,001 to 4,000, 30. So I kind of use the $1,000 buckets and $10 daily late charge differences. Now, the listing agent, again, might have given you something different that the landlord wants to see there. You can kind of measure it against this, okay? And see if it's reasonable. These items are going to be reasonable.
Is that $10 per day?
$10 per day,
so
yeah.
forth and so on.
10, 20, or 30, depending on the lease amount. So in our example, we would be putting 10 because it's 1650s inside this bracket. All right, paragraph 7, return payments. Most landlords are usually going to see at least $40 there. 35 might be the least expensive I've seen, but 40 is a pretty good number there to put in paragraph number 7. And then in paragraph 9, we've got our pet agreement. So this is where we talk about pets. So paragraph 7A says that unless the parties agree otherwise in writing, tenant may not permit, even temporarily, any pet on the property, including but not limited to mammals, reptiles, birds, fish, rodents, or insects. So, how do we get our pets agreed to in writing? We're going to use the pet agreement. So if you'll flip to behind page 16 of your lease agreement there, you'll come to the pet agreement. Now, I would suggest you probably get your pets agreed to up front. In fact, I'd send the pet agreement over now and say, just want to see, are these pets approved before I spend a lot of time writing up a lease agreement? So we want to get our pets approved there in using the pet agreement. Now, the landlord probably won't sign the pet agreement, but you can go ahead and send it to him, and that way he can review the information and give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down on whether or not these pets are approved. You can certainly have a conversation with the listing agent beforehand, but sometimes they kind of want to see this in writing. So be prepared to specifically describe the pets there in paragraph A. So A is a description of the pets. And then paragraph B is going to be the consideration that the landlord wants to charge for allowing pets. Most landlords will charge two fees. They'll charge an additional security deposit, and then they'll also charge what we call a non-refundable pet deposit, a pet fee. Okay? So it would not be uncommon if you were looking at the MLS and you came across a property that it allowed pets, and for the MLS to say something, the listing agent's telling you, dogs and cats okay, $500 deposit, $250 non-refundable. Okay? So the way I would interpret that sentence in this form is to check box B1 and B3 and put $250 in each one of those. That's my $500. $250 as an additional security deposit and $250 as the non-refundable portion.
I'm lost. Is that on a pet agreement?
Right there on B.
Here.
Yep. Number
And is
1
it-
and number 3.
And number 3.
Yeah.
So B1 is $500, B2
Well,
is
I would
$250.
say that if it said a $500 deposit, $250 is non-refundable, they're
Yeah.
telling me
That's
$500 is the total per pet.
Right.
Of that $500, you're only going to get $250 potentially back, or you're not going to get a certain amount back. Okay? I mean, if they really got specific and said $500 additional security deposit, $250 non-refundable pet fee, then yes, he would do it that way. But if they kind of said, here's the fee per pet, and of that fee, $250 is non-refundable, then I would deduct it. Does that make sense?
So essentially it could be.
You know, there's so much information they can put out there on the MLS. You got 60 characters they're going to try to fill, so they can't be sometimes as giving you every explanation. So they try to make it as short as possible to get as much information on there as they can. What was your question?
So if they had 2 pets, essentially it's $500 for the deposit and still
Always gonna be.
$250 for.
Yeah. Okay. Then on the second page of the pet agreement, there in E, the tenant has to disclose a couple of things concerning the pet. Whether or not the pet has been known to have ever bitten or act violently against someone, or whether or not the pet has the predisposition to bite or act violently. Did you see those? On the back of the pet deposit.
Is this a separate check from the first one?
Flip it over.
It's on the pet agreement, which is separate from the
Separate
lease.
thing? Yeah, okay.
Say that, what was the question?
Like when the landlord pays this, is this a whole separate, for like the pet deposit, and that's a whole separate,
Well, it could, it's probably gonna all be paid at once.
At once, okay,
So
that
you
was
just
my
add it to
question.
your security deposit check.
okay, so it'll be all one big.
Yeah, because the
lump sum.
security deposit goes straight to the landlord.
Okay,
The first month's rent goes to listing
Listing.
brokerage.
got it.
Okay? All right, so depending on the answer we get back on pets, then that kind of gives you the information of how to disclose the pets and get them approved. Then back to paragraph 9, page 3 of our lease agreement, we've got one other issue we need to deal with, and that's if the tenant's found to be in violation of the pet agreement, then how much is the landlord going to charge him for violating the pet agreement? And what I typically see there is a $250 initial fee and $25 per day that they remain in violation. Now, how do you violate the pet agreement? Well, the landlord might have agreed to a pet. And then the landlord drives by 2 months later to kind of inspect the property, and he peeks over the fence in the backyard, and there are 2 dogs in the backyard. That's a violation. He only agreed to 1 dog, and now he's shown up and there's 2. So he would have to notify them that they're in violation. He could charge them the $250, and then he could charge them $25 for every day that he discovers that the pet is still at the property.
Is the cost normally like what they would charge for pet deposit? Is that where you're coming in for the $250? I mean, I know it's just an average that you're
Yeah,
coming
it's
up
just
with.
an average.
Whatever they
It's
want
all
to
over the
charge.
place. I've seen it.
So if they don't give us a criteria, we could
Go
put
with that.
whatever numbers we
Yeah.
want there.
Exactly. And I'm kind of giving you the numbers that are typically acceptable. So you at least kind of know a barometer. We could put $50 down there, but it's unlikely the landlord would accept that. So my goal is to try to get a deal accepted. All right, next page, paragraph 10, security deposits. So security deposits are usually equal to 1 month's rent. However, the security deposit could be more, especially if it's an upper end property. You know, we call it executive property. Maybe it's coming partially furnished or fully furnished. Security deposits could certainly be more for those properties. I've sometimes seen the security deposit negotiated up to help offset underwriting standards that the tenant did not meet. So maybe the tenant hasn't been on his job very long, but he's got an income and he's got a credit score that's acceptable. And the landlord's just like, gosh, I don't know. So sometimes the tenant will go, well, I'll throw another $500 down as a security deposit. You know, those kinds of deals. My son, when he was, this wasn't on a security deposit, but we did on the rent, when he was trying to find the house down in Garden Oaks, down there, they were hot. I mean, the good ones were going quickly. They didn't even have to list them. For lease by owner signs, you know, all over the place, because, you know, those people were, you know, could do it. And he called up, and, you know, both he and his roommate, you know, good jobs, good income. And the guy says, well, I've got another application too. So my son's calling me, and I said, well, call him back and tell him you'll pay 3 months rent up front. Sweeten the deal. He goes, well, I'll loan you the money, but you'll pay me.
Don't forget that.
So he didn't have 3 months rent, but he could make his monthly rent. So they took him because of that. So. All right, security deposit. So usually equal to 1 month's rent, and then you're going to be checking those good funds boxes again, either cashier's check or money order for the payment of that security deposit. Like I said earlier, that payment is usually made to the landlord directly. Now, sometimes the tenant will kind of give you an explanation or a side story of how the last landlord, you know, screwed him out of his security deposit and deducted stuff that he didn't think he should be able to deduct from it. Well, here, this lease agreement gives you what the statute, the law, says can be reasonably deducted in paragraph D. So right above D is the website that you can go to if you wanted to be able to sleep quicker at night. You can go read the law, but they kind of give you here what the landlord can reasonably deduct from a security deposit, and he has to account for it. He can't just make stuff up. He's got to say, hey, you know, I'm deducting $500 because, you know, I had to go through the packing and removing of abandoned property that you left at the house, and here's the bill from the company that had to come pick it all up. I mean, you just can't make stuff up, okay? Paragraph 11, utilities. In a huge majority of most rental properties, the utilities are going to be the responsibility of the tenant, but every now and then you might come across a property that might include the utilities. My son again, he's in a house down in Garden Oaks that's got a garage apartment. So rather than the landlord trying to put 2 water meters on the property, he just gives them both the rent and says the water's free. So the water's included. So they both use, the water. Of course, it's 3 boys, 2 in the house and 1 in the garage apartment. I don't think they ever.
That's how my garage apartment was in the Heights.
Yeah.
It was included with the house.
Well,
so it was
you
all-
have to pay for another meter to come through. That's too much money. So they
Yeah.
just do it that way. So that happens sometimes in cases like that. So you'll know, looking on the MLS, the land listing agent again will go, this utilities included or these utilities are included. And you would want to take advantage of them if they're being offered. But the majority of the time, especially in our properties out here in the suburbs, utilities are all going to be the responsibility of the tenants. And so that would be usually NA or none there in paragraph 11A. Paragraph 12 is occupants. So here is where we go back and describe that family of 4. Who's occupying the property? So we're going to put down the names and ages of everyone that's going to be occupying the property. At the top of the next page, there's an amount of time you can request for guests to be able to stay at the property without any additional written authorization by the landlord, and usually 14 days is what goes in that paragraph. Paragraph 13, parking rules. How many vehicles can the tenant park at the property at any one time? The thing that people make a mistake here is that you've got to make sure you understand the definition of vehicles. It's pretty much anything sitting on wheels. So autos, trucks, RVs, trailers, motorcycles, ATVs, jet skis, and boats. So anything sitting on wheels at the property is considered a vehicle, and you would want to make sure you knew how many your tenant planned to park at the property. If it gets to be over 4, you probably need to caution him that might not get accepted, because most landlords don't want to see more than 4 parked at the property, including inside the garage or behind a fence. If the landlord approved 6, because that's how many your tenant had, but the HOA only allows 4, the HOA rules trump what the landlord said he would do. So actually it's on the previous page that the tenant says, I will abide by the HOA rules. So just because the landlord said, yeah, you can park there, 6, and all of a sudden the HOA starts sending letters going, hey, you can't have more than 4 vehicles parked at the property. We've noticed you've got, this boat parked in the driveway and blah, blah, blah. Well, they've got to apply, they've got to adhere to the HOA's rules. All right, paragraph 14, access by the landlord. This is probably, I would say, one of the more understood or controversial paragraphs in the lease for the tenant. Tenants kind of believe that once they've leased the property, they're never going to see the landlord again until the end. Well, that's not true based on the statements here in paragraph 14A. So let's kind of cover through these. Number 1A, advertising. Landlord may prominently display a for sale or for lease sign on the property during the term of the lease or any renewal period. Landlord or landlord's contractor may take interior or exterior photographs or images of the property and use the photographs or images in any advertisements to lease or sell the property. Paragraph B, access. Before accessing the property, landlord or anyone authorized by the landlord will attempt first to contact the tenant, but may enter the property at reasonable times without notice to make repairs or to show the property to prospective tenants or buyers, inspectors, fire marshals, lenders, appraisers, or insurance agents. Additionally, landlord and anyone authorized by the landlord may peacefully enter the property at reasonable times without first attempting to contact the tenant and without notice to survey or review the property's condition and take photographs to document the condition, make emergency repairs, exercise a contractual or statutory lien, leave written notices, or seize non-exempt property if the tenant's in default. So, tenants need to understand what kind of access the landlord may have to the property. And then paragraph C says that if the landlord or the landlord's agents have made prior arrangements with the tenant to access the property and are then denied or not able to access the property because of tenant's failure to make the property accessible, including but not limited to any occupant, guest, or invitee of tenant, pet, or security device prohibiting access to the area of the property, landlord may charge the tenant a trip charge of, that's usually $75. And then paragraph D, big bold letters is basically our CYA form talking about what a key box is, and that neither the Association of Realtors or the MLS requires the use of a key box, but the key box is a convenience and involves risk. Then paragraph D1 says the tenant authorizes the landlord or the landlord's property manager and the landlord's broker to place on the property a key box containing a key to the property, A, during the last 30 days of the lease or in renewal and extension, and B, at any time the landlord lists the property for sale with a Texas licensed broker. So if I had a lease property that I just put a tenant in, and 2 weeks later I decide to sell the property, based on everything here in paragraph 14, I can come back to the house, I can take pictures, including what the tenant has as furnishings. I can put a for sale sign out in front of the house, right? I can put a key box on the property with a key in the key box, and buyers and their agents can come by and view the property without notice. Now, we'll probably operate with notice, or at least try our best, but sometimes tenants don't understand that's what can happen. Now, if I sell that property to another buyer, that buyer must honor the lease that's in place. He's got to continue with the lease agreement. So the lease follows the property.
That's why it'll sometimes say on there, like, do not disturb the tenant.
Yeah, or it'll say tenant occupied, or,
Okay.
yeah. All right, paragraph 2 at the top of the next page, there in D2, the tenant can withdraw his authorization to place a key box on the property by providing written notice to the landlord and paying the landlord a fee of, that's usually equal to 1 month's rent. Paragraph 15, move-in condition. A, landlord makes no express or implied warranties to the property's condition. Tenant has inspected the property and accepts it as is, provided the landlord blank. So this goes back to that very first exercise that we're going through with our tenants when they're at the property and they're really looking at its condition, or what they expect the condition to be at the time that they move in. So if they've got something specific they want to have done, professionally clean carpets, remove the debris pile from behind the garage, trim the shrubs and, blow out the gutters, whatever it is, then that needs to go in 15A. And then 15B says that the tenant will complete an inventory and condition form noting any damages to the property and deliver it to the landlord within, I like 4 days, of the commencement date. If tenant fails to timely deliver the inventory and condition form, the property will be deemed free of damages. Okay. That form is behind your pet agreement. So if you flip back to where you were at the pet agreement, the inventory and condition form is right behind it. So here's what I would suggest you do, is obviously going to give a blank one to your tenant at the time he signs the lease. And I would remind him prior to taking possession that he really needs to fill this out. And if he'll fill it out and call you, you'll come by and pick it up. You'll scan it for your file and for the landlord and for the tenant's file, and you'll deliver it to the listing brokerage so that they can deliver it to the landlord. That way everyone's got a copy. Okay? It is cold. I know. You work with a lot of women.
Well, I think it's cold.
I know.
That says it all.
I thought I was the only one.
Air
who-
conditioning issues at the building is, I can never get it right. We're either hot or cold. Usually the men are all freezing and the women are walking around like this.
Oh, and then we're cold.
That's right. That's right. So, follow up with your client and make sure that they get this done, because this is what's going to help protect their security deposit. By noting that this is the condition of the property when I took possession, so Mr. Landlord, you can't come back after me and say this was broken, because it was in this condition at the time I took possession of the property. Okay? All right, back to our lease agreement. Let's go to paragraph 17, yard maintenance. Again, this is kind of like utilities. The overriding majority of leases that we'll be dealing with, yard maintenance is going to be the responsibility of the tenant, not the landlord. So you'll be checking the box that the tenant at tenant's expense will maintain the yard. But every now and then you come across one where yard maintenance was included. I had a landlord in Kingwood that he bought 5 or 6 lease houses, and he included yard maintenance in every single one. He just wanted his houses to always look nice, and he knew the tenants didn't do it. So he just made sure our yard crew came through there. He lived in the neighborhood, so he wouldn't he wouldn't be proud of his rental properties. Paragraph C, pool spa maintenance. So if the property has a pool or a pool spa, then you want to make sure you attach the pool spa maintenance addendum. So if you go behind the inventory and condition form that we just went over, these have gotten a little bit out of order. I think it's actually behind the agreement between brokers. You want to find it?
Yeah, it's behind. You're right.
So the pool spa maintenance is kind of like yard maintenance. Who's going to do it? So you've got a couple of choices. You've either got that the landlord's going to do it, or the tenant's going to do it, or the tenant's going to be required to use a service. So most of the time, and again, this would usually be identified in the MLS, so you'll know kind of going into the deal, it's usually going to be a landlord-provided service. The landlord usually will have a professional service that still comes through and deals with the pool and spa. So number one is the most common scenario that the landlord is going to take responsibility for continuing to maintain the pool or the pool spa. However, on this form, I want to make sure that you note to your tenant the insurance requirement, which is just down in paragraph D. Oh, no. Is that where it is? Yeah. There in D2, that the tenant at all times must maintain and have in effect a $300,000 general liability insurance policy. Now, I've been told by insurance agents that when a tenant purchases just general tenant insurance, renter's insurance, $300,000 is almost a given. It's there. So you always want to include tenants in the conversation about just getting renter's insurance, even if it doesn't have a pool. Tell them that the landlord's insurance does not cover their possessions. If this house burns down tomorrow, everything you have in there is going to not be covered by the landlord's insurance. You've got to buy your own insurance. Most all of your insurance agents, I just tell them to check whoever they have their car insurance with. They'll probably insure it. And it's not expensive. I don't know, $300, $400 a year for renter's insurance. It's not an expensive insurance policy. My other son, I have great son stories, has renter's insurance. He's down there in Garden Oaks. And he gets out to Kingwood one day, and he goes, I can't find my Mac. And he's just tearing his truck up looking for his computer. He calls a roommate back there, and he looked through his room, can't find his computer. And he goes, I know I carried it outside. And I guess I just put it on the hood of my car, or the truck, and drove off. So they kind of looked around on the street, couldn't find a broken computer. I'm sure it's somewhere down 610 or 59 or wherever he lost it. But he made a claim on his renter's insurance. He had a $500 deductible, and they replaced his Mac.
Oh, that's nice.
I was like,
Well
look
worth
at
the
that.
money.
Paid for it.
Yeah.
sweetest kid in the world. That'll never happen to me. All right, so everyone understands the pool spa, right? All right, so now back to our lease agreement. Let's go to paragraph 18A. Always make sure your tenants have a phone number to call. So they should get a phone number from the landlord that can be inserted here, or it could be the property management firm, it could be the landlord's maintenance guy, but we just want to make sure that they have somebody that the tenant can call if he's got repairs that need to be dealt with. Let's see. Let's go to paragraph 26, special provisions. Special provisions here is just like it is in all of our other agreements. It's a place to insert any other business agreements that need to be either clarified or maybe modified from the agreement. I've heard some people require, I've put in here 24-hour notice for access by the landlord, which would kind of tighten up that access paragraph back that we talked about where they don't have to give notice. So you could insert notice requirement in here if you wanted to. The one thing that I want to caution you against is what it actually tells you you can't insert. There in parentheses it says, do not insert a lease option or lease purchase clause without the assistance of legal counsel. Special obligations and liabilities under statute, which is always law, are applicable. So sometimes we get tenants who've heard about lease purchases, right? So they want to do a lease purchase. Well, we can do a lease purchase, but we've got to get an attorney to draw up that portion of the agreement. We can't make it up and stick it in these forms.
Legal counsel, who is legal counsel?
An attorney.
Or a person who is
A person licensed to practice law
in
Texas.
who is it?
I would guess so. Someone who knows Texas law.
For example, if there is a British barrister.
Who's not licensed? Who's not licensed?
Yeah, I don't think so.
He's a legal counsel.
Well, he may be, but I guess the term here is really legal counsel that can practice law in the state of Texas. I guess they need to be clearer there, but if I was doing a Texas real estate transaction, I would want a Texas attorney representing me on that. Now, it depends on how sophisticated that agreement is. It could be something really short and sweet, and that verbiage can be inserted here, but it's coming from the attorney. If it's more complicated, it could be an attachment to our agreement, or it could be a whole separate agreement. So it really depends on that, and it can even, don't get drawn into, the word lease option is basically first right of refusal. You know, maybe your tenant goes, well, you know, will this landlord give me first right of refusal to buy this property before he sells it to anybody else? And you're sitting there going, well, I don't know, let me ask. And you call up the listing agent and go, would they give him first right of refusal? And they go, sure. And so we stick in here, buyer has first right of refusal to purchase this property. Well, we've just done what they said don't do. So be cautious. When it sounds so simple, it's not simple, okay? All right. You were asking earlier about early termination, so it's covered here in paragraph 28. And the ones that I gave you were military service, family violence, and sexual offenders or stalking. I forgot about, but they could have rights there to terminate the lease in certain circumstances involving sexual offenses or stalking. Paragraph B gets into talking about assigning or subletting the property to a replacement tenant. Most landlords are not going to upfront agree to assigning or subletting to another party. So there in paragraph 4, you would end up putting NAs in those blanks. The boxes won't be checked, so it won't apply anyway, but it's always safe just to go ahead and put NA in those blanks there in paragraph 4A and B. Paragraph 31 is addenda. These are the additional documents that could go with our lease agreement, many of which we've covered And there's a few others that we'll cover at this point. So, number one there, addendum regarding lead-based paint. When would that be applicable to our lease agreement?
1978 first.
I would include 1978. So 1978 and earlier, I would include the lead-based paint addendum. Now, when you're in dot loop or whatever forms library you're looking at, there are two lead-based paint forms. You want the one that talks about tenant landlords, not the one that talks about buyer sellers. Okay? So make sure you're pulling the right form. Now that should come from the listing brokerage. They should already have that in place and ready to deliver it to you and your tenant. But if they don't, you need to remind the listing agent, hey, this house was built in 1977. I need the lead-based paint form. They need to go ahead and send that over, signed by the landlord, so that your tenant can receive it and acknowledge that form. Inventory and condition form we talked about. Landlord's additional parking rules is exactly what it says it is. It's a landlord's additional parking rules. It's something that he has written up and he wants your tenant to abide by. So it would be something he's prepared to deliver to your tenant. The pet agreement we've covered. Protecting your home from mold is just a form that talks about tenant. Be cautious of mold causing actions of the property. Wet sheetrock, water, in a that's leaking out of the bottom of a shower pan or something like that. Tenant should just, it kind of gives them what they should be looking for to ensure that they're not creating a mold scenario in the property. Residential lease guarantee. So back here behind your forms, I think it's actually probably behind that cool addendum, is the resident is a lease guarantee form. I guess it's the last 2 pages maybe. So the very back of your package is the lease guarantee form. So a lease guarantee is the same as a cosigner. So if you've got a tenant who is not qualified on their own to be approved for the lease, and they say, but I've got a cosigner, this is what they're talking about, is a lease guarantor. Someone who's going to guarantee the landlord that the tenant will perform. And if they don't perform, then the landlord has rights to come back against the guarantor. Okay? So you've got the form, the agreement form, and on the back side of it is their application form. So they have a 1-pager application form that they would need to be filled out and be approved by the landlord as a guarantor. And if they're approved, then the lease guarantee agreement would be included with the lease. All right, agreement between brokers is an additional form. That's right there by the pool spa maintenance too, I think. Yeah. Agreement between brokers for residential leases. So, I'm the listing agent and I go and meet with the landlord and I'm at the compensation paragraph of the listing agreement. And underneath the compensation paragraph, I've got 3 different levels of compensation. I've got the compensation for the lease. I've got compensation for obtaining or securing a renewal of the lease. And then I've got compensation opportunity for the sale of the lease property. So these are 3 boxes that I'm going to check on my lease listing agreement. So I meet with the landlord who's interviewing tenants or agents to list his property for lease, and I'm at this compensation paragraph. And I say, well, Mr. Landlord, I charge 1 month's rent to list the property for lease, and I want to disclose to you that I split that 50-50 with the other brokerage that brings the tenant to the transaction. And he goes, that's acceptable. I will agree to that, so we check that box. And then under the renewal paragraph, I say, well, Mr. Landlord, I've been pretty successful in helping make sure that landlords and tenants have such a great relationship and experience that the renewal rate is high. And so you don't have to go through putting the property back on the market because you've got dissatisfied tenants. I charge half a month's rent to secure the rent, to secure a renewal. Of that, I split back again with the agent that brought the tenant. We're so happy that agent brought such a great tenant to the property. We're going to split that with him 50-50. And he goes, no, I don't want to do that one. I feel pretty successful that I, as the landlord, am going to keep the tenant happy. You're not going to be that much involved in it. I'm not going to give you a renewal fee. Can you agree to that? It's all negotiable, right? And he says, all right, well, Mr. Landlord, maybe at some point in the future you decide to sell this property. And obviously there's the documentation that goes through that. There's the pricing strategy. There's the negotiations on that. I will certainly be your agent to help represent you in that. And since I already leased the property for you, I'm familiar with it. And since we won't have to do a lot of marketing to bring the tenant or the buyer to the transaction, because it's the tenant in this scenario, I only charge 4%. And of that, I split 50-50 with the agent that brought the tenant, or who's representing the tenant in the transaction. And he goes, okay, I agree to that. So I only get, as the listing agent, 2 out of the 3 secured in my listing. Right? When I go to put it in the MLS, and I get to the compensation paragraph of the MLS, I have to disclose the compensation for the agent bringing the tenant to the transaction. And I will say 50% of 1 month's rent. And I'll say 2% in the event that it sells. You won't see any, under renewals, it'll say no. So as the agent representing the tenant, I would want to secure my compensation by getting this form signed. So I'm going to fill this out with the compensation that's being offered on the MLS and make sure that the listing agent signs off on it. So if that was what was being offered in the MLS, then that's what I'm going to fill out on this form. So in paragraph A, under 1, I put 50%, right? Under paragraph B2, under sales, I'm going to check box A and say 2% of the sales price, because that's what's offered on the MLS. If all 3 were being offered on the MLS, then I would put all 3. If only the lease was being offered on the MLS, then I'd only fill out A on the MLS here in this form. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now the client doesn't sign this form. It's between the brokerages. So the 2 agents involved in the transaction sign the form. Everyone cool? All right, last couple of addenda. The Owners Association rules and the landlord's rules and regulations. Those would be supplied by the landlord. Post-bond maintenance addendum we talked about, and the residential lease application form was the very first form we talked about.
So what page are you on? What page are we on?
We're back on page 14, paragraph 31. All right, paragraph 32. We need to have a good address for the delivery of any notices. We've already talked about several scenarios where the tenant must give written notice. He needs to know where to send that written notice. It could be in the form of email or fax too, so make sure that you have good contact information for the landlord, and the tenant at the property would go to the property address, and then an email and fax number would be good to add there too. Last couple of things. If you skip over to page 15, paragraph 34F, if the tenants are found to be deceased during the term of the lease, or everyone who's over the age of 18 who is an occupant of the property is found to be deceased, then the landlord can only deal with the person named here or who the court appoints. So if no one was named here and the occupants over the age of 18 are found to be deceased during the term of the lease, the landlord doesn't get the opportunity to just give everything to the first family member that shows up. He's got to wait for the court to say this is the person responsible for the estate. So it's very important for your tenants to name somebody here that can act on their behalf under the unfortunate circumstance that they're found to be deceased during the term of the lease. Died in a car accident, whatever it is. Then paragraph I is a disclosure about whether or not the landlord's broker will or will not be a property manager for the landlord. There are some brokerages that will allow their agents to do property management. We don't. So some other brokerages do because they've got the proper insurance and documentation. So, but you'll see on the MLS that sometimes the listing broker is also going to be the property manager, and that will be disclosed on the MLS. Or there's a separate property manager, and so that's the box that could be checked. You could have that scenario. Maybe you've listed a property for a listing for a landlord, and he has a property management firm. So you're still the listing agent, so you would check, make sure that landlord's broker will not act as property manager, but the property will be managed by a property manager, and you name the property manager. Okay? And then that's it for the lease. So everybody gets signed and delivered. And now, once the lease is signed by all parties and the deposit check is delivered to the landlord, then it's a lease. It's an agreement at that point. I had a scenario in Kingwood while I was back in Orlando this week where 2 days later, after getting everything signed and the deposit delivered to the landlord, the tenant's house was under contract and it didn't close. And so now she says, well, I can't lease the house. So she had to terminate the lease. Well, the landlord said, well, I'm just keeping the security deposit. You're not moving in. And she's all upset. He's like, well, you signed a lease. It's not the landlord's fault that your house didn't sell. So just make sure your tenants understand that when they sign this and the money's delivered, it is an agreement. They're going to have to comply with that, just as the landlord would have to comply to ensure that they can take occupancy and perform.
The security deposit will be for each applicant?
Would be for what?
Each applicant?
No, usually one security deposit. But there could be an application fee for each applicant, because it's going to cost money for the landlord to run a credit check and a criminal background check for each applicant.
So we get those checks and take them to the listing agent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do we have that 2-day rule?
Well, you would want to make sure that the security deposit is delivered pretty quickly once the lease has been signed.
Okay.
I've not seen anything where it actually has number of days required. 3 days is typically pretty standard when they talk about immediately. So.
But I think that is only a directory provision and is not a mandatory provision, because a directory provision is one in which there is a direction to do it, but it is not followed by a penalty if it is not done.
Could be. Yes, sir.
I have several questions. First, would all these provisions differ in any way if the landlord is also the agent, listing agent, like myself?
Okay. Sure.
That's one of them. That's my.
Well, you would
that's
want
one
to
of them.
disclose, number one, in the MLS that you're the owner agent.
Okay.
Okay. And I would also put it in special provisions. Make sure that in special provisions
Okay.
that you state landlord is also a licensed Texas real estate agent,
Okay.
so that there's no confusion about roles like that.
Okay. And number two is who's responsible? Let's say that forget that I'm the landlord as well. This is I'm the listing agent. Who's responsible for scanning the applicant or checking background and stuff like that?
The landlord.
Okay.
We as the tenant's agent do not take on that role,
Okay.
because we never want there to be any question about the validity or the accuracy of the information.
Okay.
So the landlord, if you're listing property for a landlord, it's not your role as the listing agent to be the person screening everyone. The landlord needs to do that. So there are several firms out there that they can hire, and you can just Google it. Just Google landlord underwriting. Lots of firms that the landlord can sign up with to get credit checks, criminal background checks. He needs to have someone or he needs to call for employment verification, all that.
Okay. But if I'm also the landlord, I can do that legally.
If you
My
would
lease.
want to do that,
Okay.
yes. But you would not want to do that for a tenant.
Got it.
If you were representing a tenant on another piece of property, you're not handing this package over to the listing agent landlord going, I've checked them all out, they're all good.
Okay.
Because if anything came back wrong, guess who they come back?
Okay, cool.
Got it?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So when we get, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I mean, kind of like in, well, this is different than if you're selling a house, you're listing it for lease. So what happens if you're the listing agent and the renters or the tenants don't really have someone that's helping them? How would the
Well, they would still need,
compensation-
you would still want them to be represented. So there would need to be representation for the,
Yes.
for the tenant. You were either gonna act as an intermediary,
Yeah, I think you should go back.
so you get the whole 4%. 50/50 is for another brokerage.
What number is it?
He's paying Keller Williams 4%.
Right.
We're willing to split it 50/50 with another brokerage if another brokerage is involved.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So for this, could you be the person that is doing both sides?
Sure.
Where it's different with the other?
Well, I think I would, if I was the intermediary on the lease, so I listed it and I found the tenant, right? I'm not doing the agreement between brokers, because there's not another broker.
But the prorated would only.
But in my listing agreement, I had all this secured in my listing agreement because I didn't know who was gonna bring it back. Does that make sense?
I got you.
And I don't do the agreement between brokers because there's not another broker.
Right.
In fact, you don't even have to do the agreement between brokers if it's an intermediary, because it's our listing. Yeah.
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 I have another question.
Uh-huh.
On the, we talked about the seller's disclosure. Is it applied, is it for the leasing, is it like a landlord's disclosure, so to speak?
There is not.
Okay.
However, if the landlord has something that he thinks he needs to disclose, he should disclose it,
Okay.
okay?
Is there like a form,
There is not a form.
so can you just manually write something?
He just needs to put it in writing and deliver it to the tenant.
Okay.
And the
So-
tenant can acknowledge receipt of that information.
So it's optional then.
Yes. Yeah. But it's in his best. I've got a scenario in Kingwood where one of our agents actually leased a house and she's just been sick. She's been to the doctor, they've given her antibiotics, they've given her stuff. Well, she finally went and spent a week someplace with a family member and got completely well. Came back into the house, 2 days later, she's still as bad as she did before. So she actually went back to the doctor, and now they're kind of starting to look at environmental issues because she's sitting there seeing a pattern. And she finally digs and finds out that the house she's in was someone was shot at the house, and it was a drug deal that had gone bad, and probably meth was in the house.
And they should, yeah.
So she's having this reaction to the house, and the landlord never disclosed any of it. Now, he had no requirement to disclose it.
It's true.
But she's hired an attorney who's basically fired off a letter to the landlord, and the landlord is releasing her from the lease, which he should do backflips over, because it could have gotten worse where, and then maybe there's a scenario where the landlord didn't know that there was meth in the house. I don't know,
That they're not doing their job as a landlord.
but they were making meth, methamphetamines.
Drugs.
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 Bad stuff.
Like you cook it.
Have you ever watched the show
Like-
Breaking Bad?
Michael, do you need to sign this for us?
Yes.
or-
I've got some more questions.
Okay.
Okay, the checks are really kind of confusing me.
Okay.
To the landlord, he gets the security check, so that's made out to him, and they also make out the checks, and the landlord will say how much for the, criminal background check and the credit check, right?
Usually it'll be disclosed on the MLS, what
So
the
the
application
landlord will
fee
get
is.
3 checks.
Well, sometimes the application fee is paid directly to, I've seen a lot of landlords that have employed an online service
Okay.
where the tenant basically goes online and puts in their information and their credit card information, and that does the credit report and the criminal background check and all that.
And then we just send that with the application.
Well, you don't do it because that report's actually going directly to the landlord.
Right.
They're giving you a link going, go here
Yeah.
to do your
So
application.
basically, we're asking the listing agent how how the land.
They'll walk you through it. Sometimes they'll put some information on the MLS. You'll have some that you can kind of review on the MLS.
Now, the other thing I didn't understand, because, with the prorated rent, say we had those 8 days and then we had the 30 days following.
Mhm.
You know, you said they move in on the 21st, so that's 8 days in February. And what is their first month's rent then? Did you say to?
Well, it's a full month.
It's a 30 days or is it the 30 plus the 8?
It's the full month. It's 1 month's rent.
Oh, okay, so from the 21st.
So
to
on the
21st.
first, on occupancy, they pay their full month's rent, the $1,650.
Okay.
And then on March 1st, they
They'll
pay the prorated
$8,
rent.
Okay.
or 8 days.
And then on April 1st, they're back to $1,650.
Okay, that's right.
Okay.
I meant to.
Yeah.